Well, according to the clock, the bell's probably rang, but I didn't hear it. Has the bell rang? It has. Okay. I'm sorry. I'm a little tardy today. Well, good morning, church family. Hope everyone had a great weekend. Last week we discussed Genesis chapter 11, verse 31. We talked about Terah's, Abram's, Sarai's, and Lot's journey from their hometown in Ur in southern Mesopotamia to Haran in northern Mesopotamia. This week we're going to move on to Genesis chapter 12, and we're going to talk about Abram's arrival in Canaan at this place called Shechem. And this is the verse. Genesis 12:6. Abram traveled through the land as far as the site of the great tree of Moreh at Shechem. At that time, the Canaanites were in the land. And as usual, if it's in red, that's my emphasis. Means we're going to talk about the translation a little bit. And if it's underlined, again, that's my emphasis. It's not in the text. So the great tree is the translation that's used in the NIV. Moreh could be a place name or it could be something else, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. And Shechem appears to be a place name. So we'll talk about the great tree first, and then we'll talk about the Hebrew meaning of the word Moreh, and then we'll spend the rest of the class talking about the place called Shechem. The NIV is the only English version that I'm aware of that translates the original Hebrew Elon to the great tree. Most other English versions translate Elon to either oak tree or terebinth tree. However, some, the King James Version and the New Messianic Version, translates Elon to the phrase plains of. So the term Elon either means a great tree or a plain. I tend to prefer the term plain, and when I show you a picture of this area, you'll see why I prefer that. So let's move on to the word Moreh. In Hebrew, Moreh has three meanings. In an agricultural setting, it means the early rain, like the earliest spring rain. Usually the rains before the crops start coming up. If talking about a person, Moreh can mean teacher. Or as a noun, Moreh can mean instruction. Since, and I got three things here, since number one, according to verse 7, Shechem is the place where God promises Abram that his descendants will inherit the land, and since number two, according to Deuteronomy chapter 11, Shechem is the place where the instructions of Moses is given to the Israelites after entering the promised land, and since number three, Shechem is the place where Jesus instructed the Samaritan woman and his disciples at the well, I prefer the translation, the plains of instruction. So that leaves us with the single place name of Shechem. Shechem is a well-known archaeology site in the center of Israel. I have a map on the next slide. So this is a map of Canaan at the time of Abraham. What remains today of the city of Shechem is located at the site of modern Tel Balata Archaeological Park, which lies in the center of the modern-day city of Nablus, which is about 30 miles north of the city of Jerusalem. Tel Balata is a 15-acre mound surrounded by the modern city of Nablus. So this is your typical map of Israel. This is at the time of Abram. This is the Sea of Galilee. This is the Dead Sea. Jerusalem's about right here, and Shechem is right about there. Shechem is situated in a narrow valley separating Mount Ebal to the north and Mount Gerizim to the south. The valley was a principal highway for merchants and travelers moving between northern and southern Israel. Shechem's placement on this crucial trade route gave it economic importance. This is the plains of Moreh, or like I prefer, the plains of instruction. User error here. This is Mount Ebal here to the right. This is Mount Gerizim, and this is the modern day city of Nablus. And Shechem, the Tel Balata, is in a park that's right in the center here, right in the valley. So you'd have to go right through it to get through this pass here. The site before it was built up had abundant water. Note that Jacob's well is here. And would have been a great place to feed your herd in Abram's day. Now there were several biblical events at Shechem, and we're going to go through 7 of them. Shechem is mentioned 60 times in the New International Version, and I'm not going to go over every mention, but I do want to impress on you that it was very important events in the Bible happened at Shechem. And I don't think this was a coincidence. The first biblical event is the one that brought us here today. Genesis chapter 12 tells of Abram's arrival in Canaan. And in verse 7, God promises to give this land to Abram's descendants. By the way, Genesis chapter 12 does not refer to Shechem as a city at the time that Abram arrived. Although the NIV doesn't use the word place in verse 6, most English versions of the Bible refer to Shechem as the place of Shechem. And the importance of this distinction will become clear when we look at the archaeology at Shechem. So to summarize event 1, God made a promise to give the land to Abraham's descendants. I've been talking about this slide. So event number 1, God promises to give this land to Abram at Shechem. Biblical event number 2. About 200 years later, Abram's grandson Jacob returned to Canaan from the plains of Haran, where we talked about last week. The Genesis chapter 33 refers to it as Padan Aram. We talked about that last week. Padan Aram means the plains of Haran, where he worked for his father-in-law to obtain his wives. He arrived at what the Bible now calls the city of Shechem. A Hebrew language note here. In Hebrew, the word IYR in English, which is pronounced ear, like the English ear, which is translated in our English Bibles as city, means a settlement surrounded by a fortified wall. In Genesis chapter 12, Shechem is not yet a city and is referred to as a place, but it has become a city by the time Jacob arrives in Genesis chapter 33. When Jacob arrives, he purchases some land outside the city from King Hamor of Shechem, and he lives in peace with the community until the king's son, who happens to be named Shechem, rapes Jacob's daughter Dinah. Shechem then asks for Dinah's hand in marriage. 2 of Jacob's sons, Simeon and Levi, promise their sister to him, but only if the men of Shechem agree to become circumcised. King Hamor and the men of Shechem agree to the terms, and they become circumcised. As the men of Shechem were recovering, Simeon and Levi took advantage of their weakened state, and they invade Shechem and they kill every single man in the city. So to summarize event 2, Simeon and Levi made a promise, but they took a symbol that God uses to demonstrate his covenant to Abram, circumcision, and they used it to break their promise to the king Hamor of Shechem. So event 3. During the Exodus, God rescues the Israelites from Egyptian bondage and leads them through the wilderness for 40 years. Joshua then leads the Israelites across the Jordan River and starts to take possession of the land. According to Joshua chapter 8, after defeating the city of Ai, Joshua led the people to Mounts Ebal and Gerizim, which I showed you on the picture a few slides ago, to read portions of the law while the people were assembled in the plains of Moreh. The purpose of this act was to renew the covenant the Israelites had broken by keeping some of the spoils of war. Now, there's an interesting scripture in Joshua 8, verses 33 through 35, about the citizens of Shechem that suggests that the locals joined the Israelites in the hearing of the law. It appears from this text that the citizens of Shechem welcomed the Israelites. I'll demonstrate in a few slides from now that archaeology confirms this thought. So to summarize at this point, in event 1, God makes a promise to Abraham at Shechem. In event 2, Jacob breaks a promise at Shechem. And in event 3, Israel renews its covenant with God at Shechem. Event number 4. Joshua 24, verse 32 tells us that the Israelites fulfilled the promise that they made to Joseph back in Egypt, Genesis chapter 50, to bury his bones in the land that God promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Joseph's bones were buried at Shechem in the tract of land that Jacob bought for 100 pieces of silver from King Hamor of Shechem. So to summarize, in event 1, God makes a promise to Abram at Shechem. In event 2, Jacob breaks a promise at Shechem. In event 3, Israel renews its covenant with God at Shechem. And event 4, Israel keeps its promise to Joseph at Shechem. Event number 5. About 300 years after the Exodus, Judges chapters 8 and 9 tell us that Abimelech, son of Gideon, along with some of the men of Shechem, killed 70 of his brothers to become the king of Shechem. Later, the men of Shechem rise up against Abimelech. Abimelech fought against the city and ultimately killed the people there and destroyed the city. I'll show later that the archaeology supports the destruction of the city during this time period. So to summarize this point, in event 1, God makes this promise to Abram at Shechem. In event 2, Jacob breaks the promise at Shechem. In event 3, Israel renews its covenant to God at Shechem. In event 4, Israel keeps its promise to Joseph at Shechem. And event 5, the men of Shechem break their promise to the house of Gideon and install Abimelech as king of Shechem. And as a result, God allows the destruction of Shechem by Abimelech. Event number 6. Little over 100 years after the destruction of Shechem by Abimelech, Solomon comes to rule the United Kingdom of Israel. After Solomon's death, Rehoboam, Solomon's son, was next in line to the throne. The Israelites assemble at Shechem, and they reject Rehoboam in favor of Jeroboam. So Rehoboam becomes the king of Judah in the south, and Jeroboam becomes king of Israel in the north. Jeroboam fortifies Shechem and rules from there for a while. While he is there, he has 2 golden calves made for the purpose of worship, thus breaking his promise with God that he made in 1 Kings chapter 11, verses 37 through 38. So to summarize at this point, God makes a promise to Abram at Shechem. In event 2, Jacob breaks his promise at Shechem. In event 3, Israel renews its covenant with God at Shechem. In event 4, Israel keeps its promise to Joseph at Shechem. In event 5, the men of Shechem break their promise to the house of Gideon. And in event 6, Jeroboam, king of Israel, breaks his promise to God. Event 7. In the New Testament, John chapter 4, Jesus meets with a Samaritan woman at the well at Sychar. The city of Shechem doesn't exist at this time. The location of this well is known to be about 500 yards southeast of Shechem. Today, a Greek Orthodox church lies at that site. Jesus first identifies himself as the Messiah near the ruins of Shechem. In doing so, he personally is fulfilling the promise made to Abraham at Shechem. God's eternal promises are kept at Shechem, while man's promises are broken time and time again at Shechem. A good Jewish Hebrew-speaking student would recognize the symbolism of the promises made and fulfilled by God at Shechem, while the promises made by man at Shechem are often broken. So let's talk a little bit about the history of Shechem after I get a little bit of water. So we just talked about the biblical history at Shechem. Let's talk about some historical events. British archaeologist George E. Wright found evidence that Shechem began as a village around 1850 BC. This would indicate that Shechem was not a city when Abram arrived on scene a few decades earlier. This is consistent with the fact that Genesis 12 does not call Shechem a city, but a place at the time of Abraham's arrival. However, Genesis chapters 33 and 34 call Shechem a city at the time Jacob arrives there with his wives about 200 years later. Archaeology supports this claim. Wright discovered that by 1750 BC, Shechem had a double defensive wall and 2 gates. Therefore, it was a fortified city. It met the Hebrew definition of a city about 100 years before Jacob arrived. Egyptian records indicate that around 1550 BC, Pharaoh Amos I and his invading army conducted a military campaign towards Canaan. The Bible is silent about this Egyptian campaign. However, archaeologist Wright identified a destruction layer at Shechem dating to between 1570 and 1545 BC that appears to correspond to this Egyptian military campaign. Later, American archaeologist William G. Deaver later discovers evidence of a massive rebuilding of Shechem's walls, gates, and temples, along with the erection of a standing stone, all of which was completed by 1450 BC. This temple appears to be the same temple that the Judges chapter 9 calls the Temple of Baal-berith. So before I go to the next slide about the events of the history of Shechem, I need to introduce some Egyptian artifacts that support the next series of events. In 1887, over 300 clay tablets written in the Akkadian language were found by the British archaeologist Sir William Flinders Petrie at the El Amarna archaeological site in Egypt. This site appears to be a library of royal correspondence for the pharaohs Amenhotep III and his son Akhenaten, which is also known as Amenhotep IV. Since the initial find, several more clay tablets were found, bringing the total to 382. The vast majority of these tablets were written by Canaanite city rulers to the pharaoh. A few of the letters came from the city rulers in Mesopotamia and the Hittite region, which today we call northern Turkey. These letters are dated between 1353 and 1336, so they were all written within a a 20-year period, so to speak. This would be within the conquest period of Canaan led by Joshua and the Hebrews using the biblical timeline. For research and reference purposes, these tablets have been registered from EA1 to EA382. EA stands for El Amana, the place where these tablets were found. And shown on this slide are 5 of the tablets on display at the British Museum. The letters from the city rulers across Canaan have garnered the most attention because they've identified significant turmoil arising with a people called the Habaru and describe them conquering Canaanite territories. Most Bible archaeologists believe that Habaru, mentioned in these tablets, are the Hebrews of the Old Testament. However, some archaeologists argue that the Habaru are not the Hebrews, but a band of outcasts on the fringe of society who engaged in various activities like raiding, mercenary work, or serving as laborers. I personally believe that the Habaru mentioned in the Amarna letters are the same as the Hebrews of the Bible, and I hope to convince you of the same. So what I'm going to show you are translations from various of these letters and then compare that to what the Bible says of what happened in the particular city involved. And we're going to look to see if there's a correlation between the two. And the first one comes from the city of Akshaf. The Amarna letter 223 states that the mayor of Akshaf promises the Pharaoh that he will fight in a coalition against the Habaru. Well, the Bible, Joshua chapter 11, verse 1 and 12, verse 20, states that the king of Akshaf joins a coalition to fight a staged battle against the Israelites and is killed. In the city of Ajalon, Abdi-Heba, who is identified as Adoni-Zedek in the Bible, who's the mayor of Jerusalem, in a very long letter to the Pharaoh, states that the enemy has control of the countryside of Ajalon. Joshua chapter 10, 19, and 21 describe that Ajalon is featured in a major staged land battle where Israel conquers Ajalon and all the land around it. Now we'll talk about the city of Ashkelon. The same mayor of Jerusalem, and again the same long letter to the Pharaoh, describes that the land of Ashkelon has given the enemy food, oil, and other requirements. Judges chapter 1, verse 18 says that Judah also took Gaza, Ashkelon, and Ekron, each city with its territory. The city of Bethshan. Again, the mayor of Jerusalem, in the same long letter to the Pharaoh, state that the men of Gintu at the garrison of Bethshan are ready for battle. Joshua chapter 17, verse 16 says that the tribes of Joseph complained that the Canaanites at Bethshan have iron chariots, and they don't want to fight them. Judges 1:27 confirms that the tribe of Manasseh fails to drive out the people of Bethshan. City of Gezer. Yapahu, the ruler of Gezer, tells Pharaoh that the Habaru are stronger than we. Give me help. Get me away from the Habaru, lest the Habaru destroy us. Joshua chapter 10, verse 33 says, Horam, king of Gezer, has come up to help Lachish, but Joshua defeated him and his army until no survivors were left. City of Byblos. There are several letters there, the Amarna letters, where the ruler of Byblos repeatedly requests help to fight off a potential attack from the Habaru. However, none of the letters indicate that an attack ever occurred. Joshua 13:5 says that an aging Joshua warns that the area of Byblos and all Lebanon to the east still need to be taken. However, there's no statement that these lands were ever taken. City of Hazor. Actually, it's pronounced Khazor in Hebrew. The mayor of Tyre warns Pharaoh that the kings of Sidon and Khazor have handed their cities over to the Habaru. Joshua chapter 11 says that Joshua conquers Khazor and chases the enemy all the way to Sidon. City of Hebron. Again, the mayor of Gezer warns Pharaoh that both Gezer and Hebron are under attack by the Habaru. In two separate letters, the mayor of Hebron claims that all lands nearby have been captured by the Habaru except Hebron and Jerusalem. Joshua chapter 10, verse 5, the kings of Hebron, Jerusalem, Jarmuth, Lachish, and Eglon joined forces and in verse 12 were defeated. Later, Joshua attacks the city of Hebron and captures it. City of Jerusalem. The mayor of Jerusalem warns Pharaoh that Jerusalem is the last city remaining. In a separate letter, Jerusalem is now under attack. Judges 1:8. The men of Judah attacked Jerusalem also and took it. They put the city to the sword and set it on fire. By the way, the order of this indicates that this is one of the last cities taken. That goes along with the concept that Jerusalem is the last city standing. City of Lachish. Again, the mayor of Jerusalem warns Pharaoh that the mayor of Lachish has been killed by the Habaru. Joshua chapter 10, the Israelites kill the king of Lachish with 4 other kings, and then in verses 31 and 32, attacks the city and conquers it. City of Megiddo. In 3 letters, the mayor of Megiddo warns that he is under attack by the mayor of Shechem, who is aligned with the Habaru. The king of in Joshua chapter 12, the king of Megiddo is killed, but in Judges 1, verse 27, the Canaanites are still in control of the city. Well, if the mayor of Shechem takes the city, then the Canaanites are still in control of the city. And I've saved this one for last. By the way, there are a lot more. I just took a few, but there are a lot more letters. The mayor of Jerusalem warns Pharaoh that Labayu has given Shechem to the Habaru. And in another letter, the mayor of Megiddo warns that he's under attack by Labayu, the mayor of Shechem, who is aligned with the Habaru. Joshua 24, verse 1, there's no mention of a battle for Shechem, yet the Israelis are in full control of the city of Shechem. In Joshua 8, 33, 35, the people of Shechem join the Israelites in reading the law. This would suggest that the people of Shechem are aligned with the Hebrew, or in this case, the Hebrews. So now I'm going to go back to the history of Shechem. Between 1353 and 1336 BC, the Amarna letters come out at about the same time of Joshua's conquest. The biblical timeline places the start of the Canaan conquest by Joshua and the Israelites at about 1406 BC. The Bible does not tell us how long the campaign lasted. However, the book of Judges tells us that the campaign was still going on after Joshua's death at age 110 years, and well into the next generation. Assuming that Joshua was approximately 60 years old when the campaign started, that's being approximately 20 when they got to the land of milk and honey, another 40 years in the desert, make them about 60. One can assume that the campaign took well over 70 years and probably much longer. Nevertheless, the Bible timeline, along with the Amarna letters, tell us that Shechem was a thriving city at the time of the Israelite conquest of Canaan. The Amarna letters also tell us that the ruler of Shechem sided with the Israelis and aided them. Archaeology confirms the absence of a destruction layer during this time frame. Archaeologists discovered a destruction layer dating to the late 12th century BC, or about 1125 to 1100 BC. This is roughly 300 years after the start of the conquest of Canaan and in the middle of the Judges period. They found signs of burning within the inner chamber of the temple. The site was apparently abandoned for a while after this destruction. Now, this is consistent with the Bible's account in Judges. Judges chapter 9, verses 46 through 49 tells how Abimelech burns down the temple of El-Berith in Shechem with about 1,000 men, women, and children inside. Archaeologists also discover a rebuilding period that was well underway by 930 BC. Repairs to city walls, new floors, and evidence of a two-story houses, which are typical in Israel during this time period. This rebuilding appears to have begun during Solomon's reign, but continued and was completed during Jeroboam's reign. So I don't have time to go all the way through this. This might be a good place to stop. The bell's going to ring here shortly, and I will pick up on this next week. Any questions so far? I've kind of thrown a lot at you, and I haven't shown you a lot of pictures. That comes next week.
One of the events I was talking about in Shechem, is that not the place where Jacob had all the women take off their jewelry and bury them under the bow?
Yes, as Jacob is leaving, so all the men of Shechem are killed, and all the women and the children then join Jacob's entourage, if you will. And so there's a lot of Canaanites, a lot of foreigners there with a lot of their jewelry and a lot of their idols. And so Joseph has all of them remove the jewelry, remove the idols, and placed there at Shechem. But yes, you're right on target. Any other questions? We got plenty of time. Okay, well, if no questions, and let's get ready for our worship service.